going to be pretty easy for most of us to find just a few ways that we could stop using plastic in some part of our lives. I mean, if you think about using those laundry sheets of detergent instead of detergent in a jug, there's no reason why you need to have all the water shipped to you. You have water at your house. You can have your soap in a dry or powdered form. This sounds super simple and basic, and it is, but I feel like doing it helps you sort of be more conscious of what's going on in the world around you.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, and we have a very grave topic today: plastic and our toxic addiction to the stuff. Atlantic magazine recently termed our current epoch as the age of unintended consequences, and perhaps no other man-made fabric typifies this phenomenon more aptly than plastic. Touted as the great invention for the harried housewife in the 1950s, it became synonymous with all that was clean and colourful and convenient. But then it became so cheap, it became a throwaway. And now, about 100 years down the road, we're seeing that the costs far outweigh the benefits. The price tag is the planet, the entire ecosystem, and human health. What was once hailed as a miracle material has now become a disastrous liability. So what can we do about it? Well, to help us understand what's really going on extrinsically and intrinsically, we have with us today three very informed individuals: Veronique Greenwood, who is a science journalist; John Hocevar, who's a marine biologist and the Oceans Campaign Director for Greenpeace; and Dr. Roberto Lucchini, Professor of Occupational and Environmental Health at Florida International University. He's also a deputy editor of the Annals of Global Health. So welcome to you all. So let's start with you, Veronique. You wrote a really interesting piece for the Globe this month entitled "Plastic Actually Isn't Cheap," which provided a very good comprehensive overview of the true cost of plastic. What did you learn while you were researching this piece?
Well, I actually came to the problem with plastics because I'm a biology journalist, and you start to notice trends in the papers coming out, and there started to be all these papers about microplastics in corals and humans, and you often get this idea that the problem with plastic is what comes after we use the material. But that's really only a tiny fraction of the problem. And what I found when I went to go report this story was just how much the production of plastic is the problem. It's not what we do with it. It's not really a choice that consumers are making consciously. It's the making of plastic is the problem. So when I was reporting for the story, I was down in Louisiana, and in the part of the Mississippi River that was pretty much all plantations worked by enslaved people until the end of the Civil War. It's between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and almost immediately. There was really not a very long lag time. A lot of this land that had been worked as plantations transitioned, came into the hands of petrochemical companies, and plastics are, for the most part, petrochemical products. So all of this land in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is just thickly covered with plants that are making petrochemical products, including stuff for making plastics and ingredients for plastics, which there are thousands and thousands of ingredients that go into plastics, and a lot of them are not well characterized. Their effect on human health is not well understood. But the bizarre thing about actually being there was that area is also full of people who live there and whose ancestors have lived there for hundreds of years, and who have communities, who have lives, who have history there. And yet these plants are built right up against their houses. And there are a number of rules being broken here, but there's something about being there in person to see it that's shocking. That things, these factories that are making, feedstock for making molded plastics, like little tiny pebbles of plastics, or plants that are making methanol, which is another ingredient for plastics. That these plants for making materials that we fundamentally don't really need could be placed above the needs of people who have been living here for hundreds of years was really shocking. That that's happening, but until you see it yourself, it's hard to really absorb the absurdity of it. Why would we give all of this up for something that we don't even need?
So you said that once you learned about the science of plastic and the inherent risks, the pollution, the effect on human health, you said that it changes your look, your view. You can never look at it the same. And you said it has been purposefully designed to be the fabric of our lives. And that's so true. I mean, Coke have the audacity to say that people want plastic bottles. I mean, I don't remember them ever asking, but so then people think, oh yeah, we've got to have it. But you say, quote, move plastic out of the zone of the taken for granted, see it in front of you, allow yourself to feel the cost of this material, the crawfish, the graveyards, the homes of East Palestine, Ohio. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised me the most about when I was reporting this story is that I talked to a sociologist who I've talked to before, who studies how people assign value to objects and ideas. And I was interested in talking to her because I thought this is sort of plastic is such a strange material. Like it has all of these costs, but we don't really feel them when we're holding something plastic and we're looking at something plastic. How does value? How do we decide that this is cheap and not expensive? And the thing that was most destabilizing from talking with her was that I didn't get sort of an easy answer about what made plastic cheap or expensive. The main thing that she shared with me that kind of shook me was how much plastic has been incorporated into the background of our lives. It's become something that we take for granted so much that we don't even really see it. So it's not even that we look at it and we think that it's cheap, it's that we don't even really see it. And that's disturbing because it does come with all of this really ugly baggage. So the thing that resonated the most with me was the feeling that if we can bring plastic out of the background and make it be something that we actually see, we really see in kind of all its ugliness when we're looking at it, that's an incredibly powerful motivator. Because as I said to you, Mary, on the phone, like I really believe in the power of disgust. Like, I think that if you look at the plastic clamshell container around your berries and you feel the kind of visceral sense of like, this, why is this here? Like, we used to be able to get berries in paper boxes and it was fine. We used to be able to get, where I lived in China, you could, even in rural places, you could go out to the local restaurant and you'd get takeout in an enamel cup that then you would bring back. Like, it was not hard. This is not necessary, right? If you look at it and you see, all the things that I saw, people's lives being just essentially paved over and polluted out of existence. And for what? For a blueberry clamshell? Like, it's ridiculous. If you start to see that, you can't really unsee it. And I actually think that's really powerful. The problem is not really consumer behavior. The problem is the behavior of the manufacturers, and this is an issue that's going to be solved through legislation. But I feel like legislation happens because there are enough of us who are grossed out by what's been fed to us.
Interesting word, fed. We're going to get onto that in a moment. It certainly is being fed to us. So let's move over to John from Greenpeace. You're the Oceans Campaign Director. So lots of people had, I guess, their first encounters with the plastic problem by, swimming in sort of tampons or seeing dead turtles or whales trapped in the stuff. And it was horrific, these very visceral images. But now, of course, it's a much bigger problem because it's affecting all sorts of other aspects of our health that aren't quite so extrinsic anymore. Now it's inside of us. So this week, UNEP, which is the UN Environmental Programme, they're having their negotiations in Paris for the Global Plastics Treaty. This has been an ongoing thing. And you were very involved, I think, in the initiative about turning off the tap, which is a big initiative that Greenpeace are trying to get us to do, the tap of plastic, not water. Perhaps you could just give us a brief overview of the enormity of the problem from your perspective, just how bad it is, and whether you think it's possible, as UNEP say, that we could actually slash global plastic pollution by 80% by 2024, or was it 2040? 2040, I think. Is that even feasible?
It has to be. This is one of those times where, similar to, we realized at some point that the gases that we were using in refrigerants were destroying the ozone layer, and that was going to kill us all. So we stopped producing those. We banned most of those chemicals. We realized at some point that DDT was also not just killing the insects that we hoped to, but just about everything. We realized that asbestos wasn't just good at what we built it for, but it's also really good at killing people. And so we banned these things. This is where we are now with plastic. We realized that mistakes were made. Some people, I think, understood this a really long time ago, but at this point, the science is pretty clear. It's hard to deny the fact that our reliance on plastic, especially so much throwaway plastic, has been a very serious mistake. So, okay, what are we going to do about it? It's pretty clear to me that we need to be moving away from plastic as quickly as we possibly can. And the way that we reduce plastic pollution is by reducing plastic production. It's that straightforward. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful. You can't just keep producing trillions of throwaway plastic items a year and expect that we're going to keep them out of the environment some way. It's not a problem that we can recycle our way out of. We really have to deal with this, as you said, turning off the tap. We have to tackle production. And just think about the fact that we have put so much plastic into our world that it became apparent to us that it was starting to kill whales and turtles and albatrosses. Like that's an enormous amount of plastic. On top of that, it's now in the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat. It's in the soil to the point where, if you eat an apple, something that is maybe the ultimate symbol of a healthy thing to eat, there's probably plastic in the apple that was taken up through the roots out of the soil. Again, mistakes were made, but yes, there are people that should be held accountable for producing all this toxic mess. But the most important thing is what we do from here, whether we allow this to continue or whether we take the steps that are necessary.
So do you think there's enough impetus in this body of people gathered in Paris to effect the kind of change necessary? You said they just wasted 2 days on small print and they haven't even gotten up to speed, and there's only 3 days left now. That doesn't imbue me with enormous confidence that much is going to get achieved.
Understandable. I think so far, the enormous and rapidly growing concern about plastic has been enough to force the world's governments to agree to negotiate a treaty. It is not yet enough to force them to negotiate a meaningful and effective treaty. We have some work ahead of us still. Fortunately, we have another 1.5 or 2 years before this treaty will actually be adopted. So at this point, the conversations are largely about procedural stuff. And that's, they're wasting a lot of time. They haven't really even gotten to the substance yet. But that's going to start this week. And hopefully by the end of this week, they will commit to actually putting a draft treaty on paper before the next round of negotiations later this year. So I think the most important thing is not where we are today, but where we can get to collectively by the end of next year. And that is going to require a little bit of help from all of us, I think.
Okay, I hate to be a Debbie Downer here, but I'm thinking in my head about the trajectory of the climate talks, and how we've been dancing around that forever. The 1.5 cap that doesn't ever seem to have been enforced by anybody. So Inga Anderson, who's the executive director of UNEP, this body that's meeting in Paris, was quoted in The Guardian saying, "The way we use and dispose of plastic is polluting the ecosystems. It's creating all risks for human health, and it's destabilizing the climate." So here we have the big issue. Since the fossil fuel industry is chiefly behind, well, they are behind plastic production. In fact, the 20 companies who produce over 50% of all single-use plastic are top three: ExxonMobil, Dow Chemical, and China's Sinopec. They're the three top offenders. They're scared of losing their profits already from losing the fossil fuel addiction, because people are now switching to electric cars. So here we have the same people who are causing global warming. They're also responsible for the plastification of the ocean. And these two factors are among the greatest threats, I think, to humanity right now. So what hope do we really have? I mean, it's almost like we've asked, the fox to mind the chickens.
Well, that's a really important point, and is the reason why the approach that the United States is taking right now is absolutely wrong. They are pushing for a treaty that is largely voluntary, that leaves it up to each country to develop national action plans. And the US has been too scared to take on Exxon or Dow. But we know from, unfortunately, decades of experience that we can't rely on companies like Exxon and Dow to do the right thing. They will do what they're forced to do, and that's it. So we need a binding global treaty that is going to force these companies to do what is necessary, instead of asking them politely and hoping that they volunteer to. That is not going to get it done.
So Al Gore said, tracing the root causes of the plastic waste crisis empowers us to help solve it. But as you were just saying, the trajectories of climate change and plastic waste are both kind of intertwined, those two things. So just as the petrochemical industry did with global warming, they kind of put the onus on us. They're kind of doing the same thing, really, with plastic. They're saying it's our fault. So how do we shift the blame back to them and get them to pay for the cost of the cleanup? I think California's been able to do this just recently. It's passed legislation, right?
That's right. I think people are starting to realize that the myth that they've been sold about plastic recycling for decades is just that. It's largely a myth. We recycle maybe 5% of the plastic that we use, and the rest of it is burned or thrown in landfills or ends up straight in the environment. None of those are good options. I mean, the fact is that once you produce all this plastic, there's nothing good to do with it. Even the few types of plastic that might be recycled, we're really only talking about recycling it or downcycling it once, possibly twice. But after that, it's still going to end up in a landfill or an incinerator. So as people realize that, they're kind of coming to grips with the fact that they've been lied, and that the responsibility really is on corporations and on governments to hold corporations accountable and actually protect the health of our communities.
So I read a statistic today that said 6.3 billion tons of plastic, which have been produced since 1930, 9% of that has ever been recycled. And Minderoo Foundation say that if we change our throwaway mentality to reuse and recycle, we can create this thing called a circular plastic economy. So can you explain what that means? And also the fact that you were quoted as saying, we can't recycle our way out of this problem, nor should we. So.
I think the circular economy is a great concept. Recycling is important. We need to recycle things that make sense to recycle. We absolutely have to recover and recycle aluminum, for example. It makes no sense to just keep trying to mine more and more aluminum when you can recycle it over and over and over again. Plastic is not like that. There's no market because there's no value for most types of plastic. And even when we do recycle plastic, it comes at a cost. We just released a report last week, time is starting to lose all meaning for me, that demonstrated some of the pretty serious toxic concerns in recycled plastic. There are a bunch of different ways that toxic chemicals end up in recycling streams. So you definitely don't want this in your packaging that's holding the food that you eat or your drinks. And I think this is something that people are really just starting to understand, unfortunately. And but it really does underscore the fact that not only can we not recycle our way out of this, but even if we tried to increase recycling, it's going to have a real cost in terms of human health impacts.
So now we all feel really depressed because, we're doing our little recycling thing. We think we're doing our bit for the environment. Should we just not bother with the recycling of our plastic? Is it a waste of time?
Like I said, there really aren't any great answers. Once you make this plastic stuff, it's going to hurt us. It's going to hurt the environment. It's going to hurt the climate. The problem has already been created, and there's no great solution. So I think for most plastics, absolutely, it makes more sense to, well, let's just say, let's not make them. That's the answer. But once they're already made, most of the time it's better for them to end up in a landfill than to put them in a recycling bin. And they're just going to have to be sorted out before you can recycle things that are actually recyclable.
And then the actual process of recycling, just the breaking down of that, it's not good, right?
No, and
sources of other things into the environment.
That's right. There was another recent study that just showed how much microplastics are produced by the process of recycling and how much of that goes directly down the drain in wastewater.
And then the fruit that you were talking about earlier, that's because microplastics are in sewage sludge.
Microplastics and microfibers and nanoplastics, so they just keep breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. And in many ways, that makes them more dangerous. Some of the plastic microfibers can migrate through cell walls, so you see them moving through human organs. And one of the big problems with plastic is that it's cumulative. So as bad as the situation is today, every new bit of plastic that we produce just adds on to that. And that's why it's reached the point where everyone is starting to realize, oh, we have a problem. It's because we've produced so much, it's accumulated to the point where we see it everywhere. All that's going to still be here next year. The question is whether we want to keep adding to it or not.
Okay, Roberto, we've been talking about health quite a lot in this last few minutes. So we've looked at the impact of the plastic production, its disposal, it's being deposited in the ocean, in the air, generally in the ecosystem. Now we're becoming much more aware, research is indicating that there are terrible effects that microplastics are having on all aspects of human life. A Lancet report in March said, I think this is your friend Philip wrote this, there's no doubt whatever that plastic causes death, disease, disability, premature death, and damage to ecosystems at every stage of its life cycle. That was an astounding statement. I read that today. So you specialize in occupational environmental medicine, and you just recently edited the cover story for the Annals of Global Health, which was based on the findings of the Minaru and Monaco Commission. So maybe you could tell us what that is and what they discovered really about the vast array of bad health effects inflicted on us, ranging from people living near the plants that Veronique was telling us about to us ingesting it and being in breast milk and blood.
Yeah, Mary. First of all, this commission did an enormous work, and they published this report. It's a very articulated report with a lot of data analysis, and it's really a key. I think it's a key work, a key report. It was actually published in March. Then in I think in April they reported about this at the WHO in Geneva, and now there's a Paris meeting with the UN, and it's really an important work, I think. Also in our academic teaching environment, we're not being really teaching microplastics to our students. I haven't really, because it's kind of an emerging threat. And so also on our side, we really need to understand what the updated knowledge we have about the health impacts, and basically do our job in terms of research, as always, in terms of trying to understand the toxicity, all the health implications and impacts at globally, because that's right. It can damage. It can be important at every stage, from early life to the adults and the elderly, because of different vulnerabilities, susceptibilities, etc. So basically, we already mentioned what the problems are. There's a kind of this important point of the microplastic structure per se, microfraction, nano, etc. The dimension is always very important in our field. Whatever we breathe, ingest, etc. The smaller, the worse, because it can be transferred everywhere in our body. So the degradation, etc. This is an important point, but it's not the only one, because then, of course, there are all the additives. The additives, phthalates, bisphenols, organophosphates, flame retardants, PFAS. These are all additives in plastic, and and they're needed. Veronique, I think she mentioned that in the beginning. So there's a multiple components in this big mixture. In reality, nowadays, our disciplines in occupational environmental health, toxicology is absolutely shifting from let's study lead, let's study mercury, let's study one by one. I grew up with this. I was in Italy, and my school and the European schools, but also in the US, there was this type of approach. Now, of course, more and more, what are we doing is approaching the mixture, the interactions, because there's so many components, and we are understanding using big data and all this more complex, sophisticated statistical models that are more and more able to incorporate all these components at once, because their interaction can damage. Maybe one, but individually they may not. But in the end of the day, when you have so many components into the microplastic environment, let's say, we really need to try to understand what is the mixture effect as well. And within that mixture, when we mention PFAS, there's so many PFAS, just as the PFAS. So it's really a difficult job. Of course, we always have to think that technically there's a complexity into all these issues, okay? And so we really need a scientist to keep working, because it's our job, and we have to try to figure this out and deliver our results to the society, basically. And so I think that this is why this report is very important, because it's actually an update on all these issues, and it points out what are the categories that are more at the front line and more exposed, the workers, what type of workers, those who are at the extraction of fossil carbon that is needed for plastic production. And these are the typical workers who suffer respiratory diseases from the all-time silicosis, lung cancer, all the history of this because of the dust that is into that process. then the workers in the plastic production and recycling, and then the residents who are living close to production or recycling, combustion of these products, of course. There are terrible problems in terms of potential exposure into the air, into the soil, into the water, into the vegetables, etc. I don't want to be too depressing into this, but it's definitely very important to try to tackle all these details and put them together. It's a complexity that we need to be able to address and try to understand, disentangle all the components and see what the impact is, because the data that are into this report are talking about cancer, different type of cancer, leukemia, lymphoma, neurotoxicity, endocrine disorder, reduced fertility, and then all the kids, the premature birth, low birth rate, asthma, child leukemia, neurodevelopmental disorder like, impact on cognition, on cognitive abilities, so it's really, there's really a complexity into this, but definitely the data are there. I think that the next steps is also to focus not only, as I was saying, on the data given by individual component, but the interaction also with the higher temperature. What happens when you have an exposure to something, and now you also have a co-exposure to increased temperature? What's the result of this?
Well,
this is another.
Quite a lot with 9/11, the 9/11 disaster, right? But didn't you do some research on the effect on the workers that were connected with that?
Yeah, definitely. I've been in New York for 8 years with Phil Landrigan. Actually, he was him. He asked me if I was interested in working. I was in Italy, and I said yes, of course. Oh my goodness, this is such an important example of something like this. The tower collapsed, 9/11, huge toxic clouds with a myriad of components, chemicals, and also psychological trauma, of course, in that case. But again, the interaction between all these components can have a devastating effect on people's health. And so this is our job now, to look really, I think, into all these interaction between all these complexities of the components. The term microplastic in reality is kind of a different
umbrella.
Umbrella, exactly. Let's say umbrella. Good term.
Yeah, it's so I've been tracking this, of course, in the press, and sort of a few months ago they were talking about it first appearing. There's a new disease now in birds, plastiosis. These small fragments go into the digestive tract of birds, and they cause such inflammation they can't eat. So they've actually given it, this is a brand new disease, one brand new disease. And then the next thing I read, they had found it in breast milk and blood. And now apparently it's 3 sides of the placenta. It's in all 3 sides of the placenta. So I think we have no chance, because there's no way of reversing this, and there's no way of stopping it. It's just, mothers are feeding their children out of plastic bottles. The water's in plastic bottles. Often the catheters and the syringes you get in hospital that we thought were so wonderful, they're plastic. They're leaching now into you. And one thing that struck me immensely was COVID. Those plastic coated masks that we all walked around with. Every time I put one of those on, I got a rash on my face. And that was just a few hours. I'm thinking about people that wear those for hours and hours, like doctors and people, in high, close proximity to other people. Nobody really tested that. It was rather like, GM food. It's like, oh, you mean there could be a problem with plastic? Oh, it's in everything. It's like, how do you rewind the clock and take it out? It's a mammoth. Production is where we need to start, I think, to stop the production. But I don't know how fast we can do that, because we've got this terrible dependency on it. We think we can't live without it. Okay, let's look around the world. Who who's doing the best job, John, in tackling this, do you think?
But, a lot of times in the US, we hear, oh, well, but even if we did better here, you're never going to see the kind of changes that we need in Africa or Asia. And in fact, many African countries have been ahead of us in getting rid of several types of plastic. There were over 20 countries that banned plastic bags, and that's something that we haven't managed to do yet. France came out reasonably early in promoting reuse and is starting to ban several single-use items. India made some big decisions about banning single-use plastic. How well they'll actually implement those, I think, still remains to be seen. The European Union is, as often the case on environmental issues, quite a bit ahead of the United States. But pretty much everywhere in the world at this point, you're seeing conversations at some level, whether it's cities or states or countries, that are, certainly banning straws, but banning plastic bags. They're starting to ban things like cutlery and plates. They're putting in new restrictions on the kinds of materials that can be used for takeout packaging. And then, less common, but it is starting, we're seeing more incentivizing of reuse and refill, which is, I think, the future. It isn't, the best case is not just that we replace all this throwaway plastic with some other single-use material, but we, rethink the way that we've been doing this for a while. And it's not like we don't know what the solutions are. I mean, my grandparents would be horrified to see how far we've come from the way that they were brought up. I mean, they reused everything. Like when I would visit them as a kid, they reused everything. And I think some of the opportunities that we have now are sort of high tech, and we can track things better, and really cool new opportunities to have people return containers to a different facility, and it would still be tracked back and they could get credit. But a lot of it is sort of back to the future. I mean, we did just fine without all this throwaway plastic for most of human existence.
I think that's a really important point. I think there are little things we all can do that are so simple. For example, don't use plastic wrap. I don't use plastic wrap. I just put a plate over a leftover. That's what I was raised doing. You put a plate over a leftover, you put it in the fridge, right? We used to get our vegetables in newspapers from the greengrocer. Or they put them straight in the bag that you took. There was no need to plastic wrap everything. And I don't know whether it's rather like hiding corn syrup in all these things that we don't need corn syrup in. It's a way for plastic manufacturers to just offload a lot more stuff. So I think we've got to question more. So let's look at California, because California has brought in some legislation. Of course, they're always the cutting edge. They're mandating some things on plastic packaging and composting. And they also have made plastic manufacturers pay $5 billion into a fund for the next 10 years to mitigate the effects of plastic pollution on the environment and human health, especially low-income communities. So it can be done. It can be done, this unpopular kind of stuff,
I think these kinds of extended producer responsibility, EPR laws, are becoming much more popular. Quite a few states are picking them up. It's basically the polluter pays principle. Instead of all these companies putting all this unrecyclable garbage into the world and expecting cities and communities to pay to deal with it, it's actually requiring the companies that produce it to help pay to deal with it. And that's progress. But what I really don't want to see is just change who pays for the same problem. We need to use these EPR approaches to incentivize shifts away from single-use plastic, away from chemicals that are killing us all.
So you think that that's sufficient, that having these meetings with the UN at this leisurely pace is going to affect change in the kind of way we need? I'm very despondent about it. I saw how radical Extinction Rebellion was for a bit there with fossil fuels. They were actually making headway. You know, they're occupying buildings, they're laying down the road. And now, you know, even places like England, where they're pretty good about protesters, are now changing the law so they can't protest. So it's almost like the dice is stacked. That's the feeling I get, that they'll drag their feet, things won't be done quickly enough. I mean, I think California is always completely separate from everywhere else. I just want to go back to Veronique. I mean, you must have seen terrible things. You visited the parts of the country where people are living with pollution, with these plastics things on their doorstep, and I bet they feel they can't do a thing about it.
Well, actually, I feel like a lot of them feel like there are things that they can do, because I think when you've come around to basically realizing you have nothing left to lose, that opens the door to action, right? So I met on quite a number of activists down there who've actually done incredible things. You know, there are several major plants that the plans are stalled because of people who live there who decided we can't do this anymore. Everyone I know has cancer, and you know, there's a lot. I mean, as a science journalist, it's been interesting looking at the data and the research, and sometimes the lack of research, into drawing connections in between environmental exposures and health outcomes for these particular areas in Louisiana. But you know, really seeing people say, well, I mean, well, you're taking our history, right? Because there are a lot of you know, there are these like graveyards of enslaved people that are threatened by these plants, and the sort of the childhoods that their parents had aren't really available to them anymore. You know, a lot of the levees are kind of off limits for playing because now they're industrial docks. Like, and then finally you're taking away health. You know, all these people are sick. I think when people get to that point, they kind of say, well, screw it. Like, we have to do something. So I actually don't really feel depressed about this. I know that sounds a little bit absurd, but I think that the scale of the problem is such that we are going to have to do something. And ultimately, plastic is a really new problem. You know, this is a problem that we came up with, you know, in the last 100 years, and we're not going to be able to put all the plastic that's already been made back in the bottle. But going forward, it's just, there are so many things that we could be using instead. You know, we used glass before. Mm-hmm. We used glass bottles. We used cardboard. Cardboard is a really good, if you need a packaging material, cardboard works really well for a lot of things, and it is recyclable. And aluminum, it's also recyclable. Mining aluminum is really damaging. It's better if we don't, you know, you don't want to rely on aluminum for everything, but it is 100% recyclable. There are all these things that we were using not that long ago for all the roles that plastic is using. They're all still here. We haven't forgotten them.
So the one thing that makes me a little bit optimistic here is, because we actually have physical evidence, microplastics, they're there. Mm-hmm. Even if they're nanoparticles, they can't argue them away. In the case of many other things like the Monsantos of this world, who say, oh, there's no link between Hodgkin lymphoma and using Roundup, you know. And the poor man has to go for 25 years into a court case to prove one case. I think this time, at least, there's a body of evidence accumulating, medical evidence, that this stuff is in our body. And where did it come from? Well, they can't say it came from someplace else. It came from them. So there's a cause and effect here. So I'm hoping that, you know, unlike climate change that for 30 years they said wasn't happening, you know, it's going to be harder to argue your way out of this, I think. I'm hoping that that's the one solid thing that's giving me a bit of confidence. What do you think, Roberta, about this?
Well, Mary, I think that to me, this report of the Mineral Commission is actually a good one, but to me, it's not enough because it's always a matter. With my students, I always talk about different speeds in these kinds of things. There's a very rapid speed of production of developing new thing, nanotechnology, whatever. High speed because there's a lot of money that is put into the development of technologies and new materials, etc., etc. Then there is another speed, much slower, a slower pace, unfortunately, which is the speed of science. And it's not exactly the same speed. The science needs to understand, in our case, whether all these new materials, etc., can damage the health of the people. And there's already a discrepancy, a difference in the pace because I mean we cannot get there on time. There's so much stuff that is being released and produced, and I mean it's a huge disparities if you want. I mean we don't have the resources to be able to understand all of this. Then of course there's another speed which is even slower, which is the regulatory speed that comes after we as scientists go to the regulators and the policymakers, produce our data, they use our data, see whether it's a case or not to regulate something. And so it takes time, okay? And then there's enforcement, other speed, much even slower. So it's all this process, and to me, as I was saying, I mean the strength of the data. We have good tools. We're being able to measure things that we were not able to measure years ago when I started as a student. We didn't have all these sort of devices, little drones, little things that can go there, measure, take samples, and all these things. We didn't have all this good technology that is helping us to collect data. And also the health data, the way that we can use the smartphones, etc., to get the data from the people. So we have better instruments, more accurate, of course. We have good statistical models that, of course, we need to use to make a sense of all these measurements and data. But we need resources, of course. We need funding for research because all these measurements and data, whatever type of data, from cell culture to animal data to human epidemiological studies, measurement, all this cost money. And so, of course, it's also a matter of providing resources to provide more data, more science. Is there a problem? Is there an health problems? Yes. Which one? What condition? What concentration? Etc. 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 All this is needed. I guess.
I think the work that scientists like you, Dr. Lucchini, have done has been absolutely critical in helping us get to this point where we're having a conversation about reducing plastic production. We're talking about banning things, not just to protect turtles, but to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's I can't overstate how important that has been. And I think what you were saying also points to the fact that we need a much more precautionary approach. We can't wait until we have tested the thousands of chemicals
100%.
that are commonly used in packaging before we decide that we know enough to act. We know enough to be very sure that there needs to be transparency. We know enough to be very sure that we need to eliminate entire classes of chemicals like PFAS from packaging and really probably just about everything else. And that's part of what has been missing, is this understanding that we can't count on science to be able to protect us unless we take a more precautionary approach.
We've got a lot of questions coming in. I do think we should try and address some of them. This is kind of, I don't know if anyone can answer this. What organizations or foundations are funding relevant work in Cancer Alley and environs in Louisiana in particular? And to what extent, how much money are they spending to support grassroots work? Say something about community organizing work in St. James's Parish up the river from New Orleans.
Yeah, actually, those were some of the people that I met. I would say the groups that I met who were really local. There's a group called Inclusive Louisiana, and there's another group called the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, and there's a group called the Descendants Project, run by the Banner Sisters out of Wallace, Louisiana. And these are all, I mean, just fabulously interesting people who have decided, well, now's the time. So these are the grassroots organizers. This is not who's funding them. I'm not really sure where they wind up getting the money, but these are the interesting people.
Maybe Veronique, you could type those in there so
Sure.
we can share them with some of the.
Into
Okay, this question I think we might have answered. Is plastic really fully recyclable when it's stated on the package?
I'd love to take that one. So we did an assessment of all of the recycling facilities in the United States and found that only the ones and twos, the bottles and jugs, are widely recyclable in the United States. Everything else, threes, fours, fives, sixes, and sevens, even many ones and twos that are not bottles and jugs, are usually going to end up in a landfill or incinerator. And so, the industry fought for years to make sure that there was a recycling symbol, that chasing arrows symbol on everything. But that just confused people and leads more of us to put things in the recycling bin that are just going to be sorted out before they can recycle things that are actually recycled.
And somebody says, isn't reuse of plastic, like plastic bags or jars that turned into fabric or benches even, better than simply junking it?
I think, if it was up to me, I would use different materials if we're talking about refillable and reusable packages and jars and bottles. But sure, better to have a reusable plastic bottle than one that we're using once and throwing away.
Someone's asked, how do we push for change at the local government level?
That's where it starts.
Hmm?
That's where it has to start. Each of us can deal with the place that we live, the place that we work, the place that we go to church, the place that we shop, the town or city that we live in. Starting there has real impact. There are things you can do as an individual, but when you start to expand that a little bit to the community level, then it starts to really have an impact. When we talk to the State Department, for example, they say, oh, well, how can you expect us to push for measures that have not been enshrined into law in the United States? Okay, so fine. Our Congress is not exactly super functional these days, and that's pretty limiting. But at the same time, if there are states that are passing laws, then that does give the federal government more of a mandate to act. And if more and more cities and towns are acting, then that does as well.
It definitely makes a difference. In my town, we've got a Green Alliance, and they're just about to pass no single-use plastics in this town from just local organizing. It's pretty impressive, actually. Okay, what other questions? Oh, these are very difficult to answer. How do we get countries like China or India to reduce plastic consumption? Stop producing plastic and exporting it to them, I guess. Well, China makes its own. I don't know what the answer is to that. Anybody want to take that? Oh, this is a good one. This is a good one. What would you use as a replacement for plastic? Sometimes there isn't a replacement. I mean, you have to do things differently. If you're used to having your little Ziploc bags with everything's in a Ziploc bag, then you're going to have to think again. Get a glass
glass container. There are also those silicone bags
Mm-hmm.
Silicone has its own issues, but it is used over and over again. It's not disposable.
Right.
I actually think there's either a replacement in every situation, or there are changes to the system that can be made so that whatever role plastic was playing is no longer relevant. I mean, when you're facing kind of an existential crisis like this, like,
That's right.
you know, you're going to have to break it all
started to get
down.
very, very worried when I first came here and I saw these dreadful bright plastic eggs being put on trees for Easter. I'd never seen anything so awful in my life. And I thought, how can they possibly? And there was hundreds and hundreds of them every year being produced for Easter. Whoever came up with that, what was wrong with the real eggs? You could eat them afterwards.
I don't have an answer on that for you.
You know what I mean? So this is what I mean about this artificial, they create this necessity that is not a necessity at all.
Mm-hmm.
You must have, you don't have to have it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, have we got any more questions here? There's a whole slew of them. How do you remove the plastic that's already in the environment? Wow.
I think largely we can't, and that we really need to focus on making not making the problem worse. Most of the plastic in the ocean, for example, is not floating on the surface. It's in the water column, it's on the bottom. It's in the bodies of just about every type of marine life in the ocean. To try to strain out the plastic from the ocean, you'd be straining out plankton. You'd be straining out everything alive along with it. It's just not a real option. And this, again, like we said several times, once you make this stuff, there are no great options.
They have been better at collecting it off the surface, though, haven't they? Been creating those big booms that drag all the plastic off? No?
They haven't really worked. I think the efforts that have been more successful have been in rivers, trying to keep plastic from flowing into the ocean. But once it's in the open ocean, there's other than large floating nets, for example, those people have and we've helped do this. You can tag and remove those. You can remove several tons of junk all at once. But as far as, plastic bottles and lighters and all that stuff, not really.
So what's the biggest problem right now? If you had a number one objective to approach with regard to the stuff in the ocean right now, what would your answer be?
Cap and start reducing very quickly plastic production so we don't make it worse.
Okay, well, we've got a few minutes. I wanted to suggest to people that I've listed a few organizations here. Other than contacting companies themselves and demanding they use less packaging or they use more ergonomic packaging, a big container with 4 pieces of stuff in it is completely unnecessary. The CVS and Walgreens are really bad for this kind of stuff. Then you can also go into Starbucks just and say, I'm bringing my own cup, which I started to do a couple of weeks ago. There was no sign telling me they were now taking people's own cups again. There was a whole parade of brightly colored plastic containers to buy. And I said, can I bring my own cup? And they said, oh, yeah, you can. I said, why haven't you got a big sign up there telling people, bring your own cup? Right away, people... I don't see anyone doing that anymore. And there was quite a lot of people before the pandemic taking their own containers. You can join organizations, Beyond Plastic, which is trying to phase out plastic. Human Rights Watch have a very active plastics division. Greenpeace is very on the plastic problem. The Ocean Cleanup, the Minderoo Foundation, which we mentioned. And then there's another organization called Common Seas, which is also trying to clean up water. So any last words from each of you? Any words of wisdom or optimism for us on this topic? So let's start with you, Veronica.
I think it's actually going to be pretty easy for most of us to find just a few ways that we could stop using plastic in some part of our lives. I mean, if you think about using those laundry sheets of detergent instead of detergent in a jug, there's no reason why you need to have all the water shipped to you. You have water at your house. You can have your soap in a dry or powdered form. This sounds super simple and basic, and it is, but I feel like doing it helps you sort of be more conscious of what's going on in the world around you. Bar soap. We don't really need soap that comes in a plastic bottle with a pump. It's not, and actually now there's bar shampoo and bar conditioner, and frankly speaking, you probably don't need to shower as often as you've been told. So there's that also on the table. But I think there are all kinds of things in the products that we use every day that you could, there are now alternatives available. You can buy deodorant in a little cardboard tube now. It's out there. You don't need to buy plastic.
I must say, I was challenged just on that topic. Several weeks ago, I tried to get a toothbrush that wasn't plastic, because I used to always get a wood toothbrush with bristles, and most places sold them. I could not find one anywhere in any shop. The same way it's impossible to get toothpaste anymore that isn't in a plastic tube. It wasn't so long ago that was metal, the tube. So I had to go online and buy toothbrushes online, which again annoys me, because then you get packaging from Amazon sending you your single toothbrush or your 2 toothbrushes. So it's definitely a challenge just to find something common like a toothbrush that's made of wood. Anyway, did you say all you wanted to say on that and your suggestions? All right, John, what about you?
I've been doing this kind of work for a very long time, and opportunities like a global treaty are very, very rare. You know, they usually come along maybe once in a lifetime. So we have to make sure that this opportunity counts. And right now, everything is still on the table. We could end up with something that really does go a long way to deal with this problem, or not. And that's going to come down to, in no small part, what the Biden administration, what the US decides to do. And so I think if each of us were to contact our member of Congress, and if you're not in the US, your elected officials, and have them call the president and say, we're really disappointed with the approach that you're taking on the plastic treaty. We want real action. That is going to have an impact. If they're hearing from senators, if they're hearing from members of Congress, it will change their position.
Very good. And Roberto, anything from you?
Well, basically, yeah, of course, the global treaty is absolutely important. I totally agree. If I have to think about what we can also do, I guess that absolutely information communication like this one. And again, I'm convinced that more science is always needed. I totally agree with the precautionary principle, but I mean, it's usually not, unfortunately, not really considered. So there's never enough evidence. So we keep providing that evidence, of course, but at the same time, teaching, communicating, providing information. Public opinion is important to me, and to raise awareness, it's always important. So communication to the people, address all these problems. And in our field as well, I was looking into our books and there's not really a microplastic chapter. Interestingly, you can find lead and mercury, cadmium, whatever, PFAS, etc. Not much about this. So to me, that tells me also we need to, focus more on these problems. And again, teaching and training and providing information is key.
You have to start to write the book. Add that to your list. All right. Well, I felt that this was an extremely enlightening discussion with you people today. You have been all wonderfully gracious and sharing your time and your knowledge. So thank you to Veronique Greenwood, John Hocevar, and Dr. Roberto Lucchini. Okay. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and of course, all of you. So if you haven't given us anything for a while or ever, you can go to the website www.cambridgeforum.org, where you can sign up for the newsletter freely, no charge for anything. On the website, you'll find podcasts of this forum and lots of others, and video links to past programs. And we've also got a large collection of digitized classic recordings. We produce a weekly NPR broadcast of Cambridge Forum, and a video of today's program will be uploaded shortly to YouTube, courtesy of our partners, GBH Forum Network. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you'll sign up to join us all again on June 14th, and have a good evening. Thanks. Bye-bye.